Hi everybody, here is the semester 1 final exam review video for day 2. So let's start with this nice problem. This says in the figure, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, so I'm going to mark that up. Remember, those little arcs mean that the angles are congruent. DF, which is right here, bisects angle CFE. So let's do a quick reminder of what bisect means. Bisect means to cut in half, and you are cutting it perfectly in half, which means you are creating two congruent parts. So when I say that something bisects something else, it's actually really saying that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Because DF is cutting that angle perfectly in half. Now this says if angle CFA is x plus 3, so make sure you take note that CFA is this entire large angle right here. So that angle is x plus 3. And then we know that DFE is 2x plus 1. They want us to find the measure of CFD. Well, if angle 4 is 2x plus 1, angle 3 must also be 2x plus 1 because they are congruent. So now we need to solve for x. So one thing you might notice is that all of these angles form a straight line. And we know that straight lines should add up to 180 degrees. So we can make a nice equation by saying x plus 3 plus 2x plus 1 plus 2x plus 1 equals 180. So we added up our three parts and we set it equal to 180 because it forms a straight line. Now let's combine like terms. So we get 5x plus 5 equals 180. And now we can finish solving for x. So we get x equals 35. But don't box your answer because they don't want to know what x is. They want to know the measure of angle CFD. So if you look at that angle, that's angle 3. So we know that angle CFD is 2x plus 1. So now we can substitute our x value, which was 35. And we get angle CFD is 71 degrees. Okay, in this problem it says angle 1 is 15x plus 7 and angle 2 is 2x plus 3. Find the value of x. Okay, so let's start by marking up our picture. So it says angle 1 is 15x plus 7 and angle 2 is 2x plus 3. So when you look at these two angles, you might notice that putting them together forms a straight line. And remember, straight lines should add up to 180 degrees. So we can say 15x plus 7 plus 2x plus 3 equals 180. So we can combine like terms. And we can finish solving for x. So we get x equals 10. Now check your original question. They ask us to find the value of x, which means we are done. So here it says, determine whether the conjecture below is true or false. If false, give an appropriate counterexample. So remember, a counterexample simply proves that a statement is false. And another way to say false is not true. So this statement says two angles are complementary. So remember, complementary means that they add up to 90 degrees. So that's our given. So the conjecture, which is just a statement, is that both angles must be 45 degrees. So while this does work, 45 and 45 do add up to 90, they say that it must be 45 degrees, and that's just simply not true. So it's false. In our counterexample, there's a number of different ones that could work, but we could say that the angles could be 60 degrees and 30 degrees. Those two angles are also complementary. And you could even say like the angles could be 50 and 40, or the angles could be 70 degrees and 20 degrees, as long as you're showing that that conjecture is not true and giving a reason why. Okay, so here we have two statements and a conclusion, and they want us to decide if the conclusion is valid, and then if it is valid, to determine the law of deductive logic that is used. So really quick, I want to review some of the laws that we talked about. So the laws of deductive logic. So we talked about two different laws. There was the law of syllogism, and then the law of detachment. So the law of syllogism was the one that stated if P, then Q, if Q, then R, therefore, if P, then R. So here, remember, we were looking for similarity in two parts of the statements, and it's essentially just the transitive property. So it needs to look exactly like this to be considered logical according to the law of syllogism. Now, the law of detachment was a little bit different. The law of detachment says, if P, then Q is statement 1. Statement 2 would be P is true. Therefore, the conclusion is Q is true. And it does need to look exactly like this. So let's look at the statements in the conclusion. This says, if a student is in room 523, that's P, then that student is in Miss Reddy's class. So that's our Q statement, if P, then Q. Statement 2 says, the student is in room 523. So that's saying P is true. And the conclusion says, the student is in Miss Reddy's class. So that says Q is true. So you can see that this is clearly the law of detachment, and it does follow that pattern perfectly, so it is considered logical or valid. Okay, here we're asked to write the conditional form of the following statement. All dogs have 4 legs. So a conditional statement is really just an if-then statement. So if something, 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 then something, something, something. So we just have to take this and write it as an if-then statement. So all dogs have 4 legs. So we could say, if you are a dog, then you have 4 legs. So it's as easy as that. You just have to make sure you have an if-then, and you have to make sure the order stays the same. So dogs has to be the first part. That's our hypothesis. And 4 legs has to be the second part. It has to be if P, then Q. So make sure you maintain the same order. So this problem asks us to write the converse of a statement. If Sally drinks coffee, then she will stay awake. So there were 4 forms to these statements that we talked about. There was the conditional statement, there was the converse statement, there was the inverse statement, and lastly, there was the contrapositive statement. So the conditional statement, which we just talked about, is if P, then Q. A converse statement is just switching the two. So it's saying if Q, then P. An inverse statement is if not P, then not Q, Remember, this little squiggly means the word not. So for example, if Sally does not drink coffee, then she will not stay awake. And the contrapositive is if not Q, then not P. So those are the 4 things you need to know. So let's go diagram our original statement. If Sally drinks coffee, that's our P statement, then she will stay awake. That's our Q statement. So to do the converse, which is right here, we're just going to do if Q, then P. So we can say, if Sally stays awake, then she will drink coffee. So this is the converse statement. But you should also be able to write an inverse or a contrapositive for any conditional statement as well. Okay, so for this problem, it says in the figure, angle COA is 5x minus 4. And angle BOD right here is negative 2x plus 3. Find the measure of COA. So one thing that you might notice is that these 2 angles are vertical angles. And we know that vertical angles are always congruent. So since they're congruent, we can set their values equal to each other. And then from here, we can solve. So let's add 2x to both sides. And then we can finish solving for x. So we get x equals 1. But if you check the question, if you read it carefully, they want us to find the measure of angle COA. So angle COA is 5x minus 4. So we need to substitute our x value. And we just happen to also end up with 1, except degrees, because it's an angle. So look for vertical angles because we know that they are congruent, so we can set their values equal to one another. Okay, so this one says, in the figure BC bisects angle DBA. So here's BC, and it bisects the angle DBA. Remember, when you have a bisector, bisect means to cut in half, and it creates 2 congruent parts, which means that angle 2 is congruent to angle 1. So this says that DBC is 4x plus 1, and CBA is 5x minus 2. So since they are congruent, we can set them equal to each other in an equation. So here I'm going to pick the smaller x value, and I'm going to subtract that from both sides. And then in one more step, we can finish solving for x. We get x equals 3. However, once again, we're not asked to find x. We want the measure of angle DBC. So DBC is 4x plus 1. So we're going to substitute our x value, which is 3. And we get 12 plus 1, which is 13 degrees because it is an angle. Okay, just a few more. This one says to write an equation in point-slope form. So remember, point-slope form is really nice for helping us make linear equations. Looks like this. Y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. So you do need 3 things to do this. You need an m value, which is the slope. And then you need an x1 and a y1, which just come from some coordinate, a point on your line. So if you substitute those three things, you can make a linear equation. So luckily, in this problem, we are given m and we are given a point, which is going to be our x1, y1. So let's just substitute it into our point slope form. So we have y minus y1, which is 6, equals m, which is 3, times x minus x1, which is 2. So this is actually the answer in point slope form. It's not in slope intercept how we typically see linear equations, but this is what the problem asks for. So we're done. Now here, we're asked to find the equation of a line that passes through negative 3, 1. So that's going to be our x1, y1. And perpendicular to the line 3x minus 2y equals 12. So in this problem, they are telling us the word perpendicular as a clue to what the slope of our line will be. So perpendicular, when you're working with linear equations, means that the two lines have opposite reciprocal slopes. So opposite meaning one is positive and one is negative, and reciprocal meaning you flip the numerator and denominator. So it has to have both parts. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to find the slope of the other line, 3x minus 2y equals 12. And the best way to find the slope is to rewrite it into slope-intercept form. So if we can make our equation look like this, we're just going to look for that m value. So we want our equation to say y equals, so we're going to start by subtracting 3x from both sides. And then we also need to divide every single term by negative 2. That means that our equation will just have y isolated on one side. So a negative and a negative become a positive when you're dividing. So we have positive 3 halves x, and positive 12 divided by negative 2 is negative 6. So this is the equation of the other line. Oops. So the slope of this line is 3 over 2, which means that the slope of our other line is going to be the opposite reciprocal. So it's going to be negative 2 over 3. So notice it went from positive to negative, and it went from 3 over 2 to 2 over 3. And then remember, we also have that 0.31, which is our x1, y1. And we're going to plug that into our point slope formula, which looks like this. Okay, so we have y minus y1 equals m, negative 2/3, times x minus x1. So I want to remind you, when we are subtracting a negative, like minus negative 3, both of the negatives turn into a single plus sign. Subtracting a negative is really just adding. So from here, we're going to distribute. So we have y minus 1 equals negative 2/3 x. When we multiply negative 2/3 to positive 3, the 3 on the top will cancel out with a 3 on the bottom, and we're left with just negative 2. And then our last step is going to be to add 1 to both sides. And we are left with y equals negative 2/3 x minus 1. So unless the problem specifically says to write the answer in point slope form, we're going to want to write our answer in slope intercept form. So this will be our final answer. Okay, our last problem here is to find the length of the segment that joins negative 2, 1 to 7, negative 1. So if we're asked to find the length of something, we're really going to find the distance between the 2 points. And there is a distance formula that you will need to know. So that distance formula is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So I always like to start by labeling our points, x2, y2, and x1, y1. So it helps when we're substituting, so we avoid small mistakes. So x2 is 7, and I'm doing minus -2, so it becomes plus 2 squared. y2 is -1 minus 1 squared. Now we're going to start just by simplifying what's in the parentheses, following our order of operations. And be careful, -1 minus 1 is -2. And now we are going to do our exponents, so 9 squared and -2 squared. So 9 squared is 81. -2 squared becomes positive 4 because -2 times -2 becomes a positive. So now we can say that it is the square root of 85. So of course, anytime we have a radical, we want to check to see if we can simplify it. But if you factor out this radical, you're left with just 5 times 17. So there's no pairs that we can simplify out. So the square root of 85 is our final answer. Okay, that is all for today. Thank you for watching.